March 15, 1945. Exactly 54 days before Hitler put a bullet through his own skull in a Berlin bunker. 54 days before Nazi Germany collapsed into rubble and ash. 54 days before the war that killed 60 million people finally ended. But Margaret Hoffman did not know any of that. She only knew one thing. She was about to die. Camp Ellis, Illinois. 6:47 a.m. Temperature 23 degrees below freezing. 31 German women stood in formation, breath turning to ice in the air. No explanation, no warning. Just 5 words barked in broken German that made Margaret's blood run cold. Get in the truck. Those words meant death. Everyone knew what trucks meant. You climbed in. You never climbed out. The stories passed through every barracks in every camp. Prisoners loaded up at dawn, driven away, never seen again. No graves, no records. Just gone. Margaret was 23 years old. She had survived the Allied invasion of France, survived capture, survived the ship across the Atlantic, survived 6 months in an American prisoner camp. And now, standing in that frozen formation, she was absolutely certain her survival had just run out. But here is where history takes a turn so unexpected, so completely insane, that if I told you the ending right now, you would not believe me. Because what happened to Margaret Hoffman over the next 8 months would become one of the most effective psychological weapons of World War II. A weapon that cost nothing. A weapon that required no bullets, no bombs, no bloodshed. A weapon that defeated Nazi ideology, not through destruction, but through something the Germans never saw coming. Human decency. Let me take you back. By March 1945, America had a massive problem. 425,000 German prisoners of war sat on American soil. Read that number again. 425,000 enemy soldiers eating American food, sleeping in American beds, breathing American air, while American boys died fighting their countrymen across the ocean. The public wanted blood. Families who had lost sons at Normandy demanded these prisoners suffer. Politicians called for harsh labor camps. Generals suggested working them until they dropped. Eye for an eye. Pain for pain. Death for death. It made perfect sense. The Nazis had built concentration camps. They had starved prisoners. They had committed atrocities that would haunt humanity forever. Why should their soldiers receive anything better? But someone in Washington made a different calculation. A calculation so counterintuitive it bordered on madness. What if treating prisoners well was actually a weapon? What if kindness could accomplish what cruelty never could? The theory was simple. German soldiers captured on the battlefield would eventually go home. They would tell stories. They would describe how Americans treated them. If those stories were tales of brutality, they would confirm Nazi propaganda. Germans would fight harder, surrender less, resist longer. The war would drag on. More Americans would die. But if those stories were tales of fairness, of decent treatment, of humanity, that would shatter the Nazi narrative. It would prove everything Hitler said about America was a lie. It would plant seeds of doubt in German minds. Seeds that would grow into questions. Questions that would become cracks. Cracks that would bring the whole ideology crumbling down. It was psychological warfare disguised as mercy. Genius wrapped in compassion. The most sophisticated propaganda operation of the war required no propaganda at all, just simple human decency applied consistently. None of this mattered to Margaret as she climbed into that truck. She had been a telephone operator in the Wehrmacht, a nobody, a small cog connecting calls and relaying messages. When the Allies swept through France in the summer of 1944, her unit scattered like leaves in a hurricane. She remembered running, smoke everywhere, explosions shaking the ground, American voices shouting words she could not understand, hands going up, knees hitting dirt, the war ending in seconds. The processing was efficient. Name, rank, unit. Then marching, then ships, then America. When Margaret first saw New York Harbor, her mind broke a little. Buildings standing tall against the sky, lights blazing everywhere, no rubble, no craters, no ruins. It looked like a photograph from 1938, before everything went wrong. Germany was being bombed into dust while America stood completely untouched. The unfairness of it burned in her chest. Camp Ellis became routine. Wake up, work, eat, sleep, repeat. The food was better than anything in Germany. 3 meals a day. Meat sometimes. Bread always. She gained weight for the first time in years. She wrote letters home that took months to arrive. The responses described a different planet. Her mother eating potato peels. Her father trading everything for scraps. Her brother vanished somewhere in Russia, probably dead. And now, the truck. The engine rumbled. Canvas walls blocked the view. 15 women sat in darkness, each one convinced she was taking her last ride. Hannah grabbed Margaret's hand, squeezed until bones ground together. Nobody spoke. What was there to say? Margaret's mind raced through possibilities. Labor camp, mine shaft, mass grave. She had heard all the stories. The Americans smiled to your face and killed you when no one watched. That was what the officers always said. Trust nothing. Believe nothing. The enemy lies. But something was wrong with this death march. The guards were not tense. They slouched against the truck walls, bored chatting in English about things Margaret could not understand. One of them ate a sandwich. Another laughed at something. This was not the behavior of executioners. This was not how men acted when driving prisoners to their deaths. 90 minutes passed. The truck slowed, stopped, engine off, silence. Then, birds. Margaret heard birds singing outside the canvas. The absurdity almost made her laugh. How could birds sing when her world was ending? How could anything be normal when she was seconds from a bullet? The canvas ripped open. Light flooded in. A voice said something in English. Everyone out. Margaret's legs barely worked. She half fell from the truck, stumbling, catching herself looking up. And everything she knew about Americans collapsed in that single moment. No guard towers, no barbed wire, no machine guns or concrete walls, or any of the things she expected. Instead, she saw a farmhouse. White walls, green shutters, smoke curling from a chimney. A red barn with doors wide open. Chickens scratching in the dirt. Fields stretching to the horizon. A farm. An old man walked toward them, 60 years old maybe, face weathered by decades of sun and wind, work clothes, dirty boots. Behind him, a woman in an apron. They looked like the grandparents Margaret remembered from childhood, before the war turned everyone into ghosts. The man spoke one word in terrible German. Welcome. Margaret heard the word, but could not process it. Welcome, welcome. This was the enemy. This was the nation her country had sworn to destroy. These people should hate her. They should want her dead. Their sons were fighting and dying against her countrymen at this very moment. Welcome made no sense. The sergeant explained through hand gestures and broken phrases. Work on farm, follow rules. No trouble. 3 women here. Others going to different farms. Simple. Mrs. Anderson, the farmer's wife, led them toward the house. She spoke in English none of them understood, but her meaning was clear. Come, inside, warm. The kitchen hit Margaret like a physical blow. Warm air after hours of cold. Smells she had forgotten existed. Fresh bread on the counter. Coffee brewing. Something cooking on the stove. Her stomach clenched so hard it hurt. They sat at the table, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, waiting for the trick, waiting for the cruelty hiding behind this performance. Mrs. Anderson started putting food in front of them. Scrambled eggs, butter, real butter on thick slices of bread, bacon, potatoes. More food in one meal than Margaret had seen in months. The first bite destroyed her. She was crying before she understood why. Tears streaming down her face as she chewed eggs that tasted like her childhood. like mornings before the war, like a world that no longer existed. Hannah was crying too. Elizabeth just stared at her plate, paralyzed, unable to believe. Mrs. Anderson watched them eat. Her expression held something Margaret could not read. Sadness, maybe. Or pity. Or something else entirely. The contradiction crashed through Margaret's mind. These people were the enemy. Her government had told her Americans were greedy, corrupt, violent. That they brutalized prisoners. That they represented everything wrong with the world. And yet this woman, this grandmother with flour on her apron, was feeding German soldiers like they were family. One of them was lying. Either her government or her own eyes. The workers' quarters were simple. 3 beds, clean blankets, a stove for heat. After the barracks at Camp Ellis, where 30 women shared one room, this felt like a palace. Private. Warm. Safe. Rest today, Mr. Anderson told them through gestures. Work tomorrow. Margaret lay in that bed, staring at the ceiling. Her stomach was full for the first time in years. Her body was warm. She was alive when she should be dead. And nothing made sense anymore. The next morning she learned to feed chickens. The day after collecting eggs. Then the garden. Then the barn. The work was hard, but not cruel. Honest labor. The kind of work humans had done for thousands of years before anyone invented words like Wehrmacht, or Nazi, or war. She discovered she was good at it. Her hands learned new skills. Her body grew stronger. The Andersons taught her English words. Chicken, cow, rain, bread. Simple words for simple things. Words that had nothing to do with death or destruction or defeat. Lunch came to the fields every day. Sandwiches thick with meat. Fresh milk. Sometimes pie. The abundance was obscene. Margaret would eat these meals and think about her mother's letters. Grass soup. Dandelion leaves. Neighbors starving. Children dying. Guilt ate at her worse than hunger ever had. How could she accept this when her family suffered? How could she enjoy anything while Germany burned? Every meal felt like betrayal. Every warm night felt like treason. But something else was happening too. Something she could not name. Something growing in the cracks of her certainty. She watched Mr. Anderson complain about the government over dinner. Openly, loudly, criticizing politicians by name. In Germany, that meant prison. Here it meant nothing. Just an old farmer grumbling about taxes. She watched Mrs. Anderson vote in a local election. Vote. A woman. Making political decisions. Having a voice that mattered. She watched the Andersons disagree with each other, argue, compromise, laugh. Their son James was fighting in Europe, maybe fighting Germans at this very moment, but they treated Margaret with kindness anyway. They separated the war from the person, the nation from the individual. These were supposed to be the corrupt ones, the weak ones. The inferior civilization her leaders had promised to destroy. Everything she believed was either true or her eyes were true. Both could not exist. The letters from home got worse as spring turned to summer. Her mother wrote that the bakery had closed. No flour left anywhere. Her father was trading his last possessions for scraps. The Americans were bombing day and night. Nothing was left. Margaret read these letters with a full stomach. Clean clothes. Healthy body. She had gained 15 pounds since arriving at the farm. Her face had filled out. When she looked in the mirror, a stranger stared back. Someone who looked alive. The shame was unbearable. But beneath the shame, something else was growing. Questions she was afraid to ask. Doubts she was afraid to admit. If Germany was right, why was Germany starving? If America was weak, why was America winning? If the Nazis told the truth, why had every truth they told been wrong? These questions would eventually crack Margaret's world wide open. They would transform her from prisoner to witness to something far more important. But that transformation required one more moment. One conversation that changed everything. It happened on a July afternoon, too hot for work. Mrs. Anderson sat down in the dirt beside Margaret, pulled out a photograph, and said 4 words that shattered the last wall standing between enemy and human being. What those words were, what they meant, and how they changed Margaret forever, that comes in part 2. In part 1, Margaret Hoffman climbed into a truck expecting death and found a farm instead. She ate meals that would have fed her starving family for a week. She worked alongside Americans who should have been her enemies, but treated her like a guest. And everything she believed about the world began to crack. But belief does not die easily. Propaganda planted deep in the mind does not simply vanish because reality contradicts it. Margaret had spent years being told Americans were monsters. One farm family's kindness could not erase that overnight. Or could it? Here is a statistic that will change how you understand World War II. Of the 425,000 German prisoners held in America, fewer than 1% attempted escape. Compare that to German camps, where Allied prisoners tried to escape constantly, desperately knowing capture meant death. American prisoners ran because staying meant suffering. German prisoners stayed because leaving meant losing something they had never expected to find: humanity. And this is where Margaret's real war began. Not against the Americans, against everything she had been taught to believe. The internal battle started the moment she swallowed that first bite of eggs in Mrs. Anderson's kitchen. It intensified every day she spent on that farm. 2 voices fought inside her head, and neither would surrender. The first voice was Germany. 6 years of newspapers, radio broadcasts, films, speeches, all saying the same thing. Americans are decadent. Americans are weak. Americans exploit and destroy. Their democracy is chaos. Their freedom is license. Their soldiers are cowards who fight only because they have superior numbers and equipment. Never forget who you are. Never trust the enemy. Loyalty to the Reich above all else. The second voice was her own eyes. Mrs. Anderson serving breakfast with a smile. Mr. Anderson teaching her English words with infinite patience. Food appearing 3 times a day without conditions or cruelty. Work that was hard but fair. Treatment that followed rules even when no one was watching. One voice was lying. Margaret did not know which one. Hannah felt the same conflict. Late at night in their quarters, the 3 women would whisper their doubts like confessions. This kindness must be a trick, Hannah insisted. They are softening us for something. Americans do not simply feed enemies. There must be a purpose we cannot see. Elizabeth disagreed. What purpose? We work their farms. We cost them nothing. They gain cheap labor and we gain survival. It is simple economics, not kindness. But Margaret saw something neither of them mentioned. The Andersons did not need them. The farm had operated for decades without German prisoners. Neighbors helped during harvest. The work got done. Taking in 3 enemy women was a choice, not a necessity. Why make that choice? The question haunted her through April and May. She watched the Andersons closely, waiting for masks to slip, waiting for the cruelty hiding beneath the performance. It never came. Mr. Anderson complained about politicians at dinner, loudly, by name. Called the president things that would have meant prison in Germany. Called local officials idiots and fools. His wife rolled her eyes and told him to eat his vegetables. Nobody arrested anyone. Nobody reported anyone. Criticism of leadership was just conversation. Mrs. Anderson voted in a local election. Margaret watched her walk to the polling station and cast a ballot. A woman deciding who would govern. Having a voice that mattered. In Germany, women supported their husbands and raised children for the Reich. Here, women made political choices as equals. The Andersons argued with each other. Not the cold silence of German marriages where the husband commanded and the wife obeyed. Real arguments with raised voices and strong opinions and compromise at the end. They disagreed and still loved each other. Conflict did not mean betrayal. These people were supposed to be the weak ones. The corrupt civilization Germany had promised to destroy and replace. Every observation drove another crack through Margaret's certainty. But cracks are not collapse. She could have lived with cracks forever, patching them with excuses and explanations, maintaining the wall between propaganda and reality. Then came July 14th, 1945. The day was brutally hot. Work stopped at noon because the heat made labor dangerous. Mrs. Anderson brought lemonade to where Margaret sat in the shade of the vegetable garden. Real lemonade, cold and sweet. Condensation running down the glass like tears. Mrs. Anderson sat down in the dirt beside her. This shocked Margaret more than anything. The farm owner, 60 years old, wearing her good apron, sitting in the dirt like a field worker, like an equal. She pulled something from her pocket. A photograph, creased and worn from handling. A young man in American uniform smiling at the camera with eyes that looked exactly like Mrs. Anderson's eyes. "My son," Mrs. Anderson said slowly. "James, France, fighting." Margaret understood. James Anderson was somewhere in Europe at this very moment, fighting Germans, maybe killing Germans, maybe dying at German hands. And his mother sat here feeding German prisoners anyway. Mrs. Anderson pointed at the photograph, then at Margaret. "Your people," she said. "Maybe kill my boy." The words hit like bullets. Margaret wanted to run, wanted to hide, wanted to be anywhere except sitting next to this woman whose son her countrymen might be murdering right now. But Mrs. Anderson was not finished. "You have?" Brother Margaret nodded. Her throat was too tight for words. "Where Russia?" Margaret forced the word out. "Maybe dead." She pulled her own photograph from the pocket she always kept it in. Her brother Heinz in his Wehrmacht uniform. Taken in 1942, back when everyone still believed victory was possible. Back when the future seemed bright instead of ash. Mrs. Anderson took the photograph, studied it for a long time, looked at Margaret's face, looked at Heinz's face, saw the resemblance, saw the loss. Then she did something that shattered every wall still standing in Margaret's mind. She reached out and took Margaret's hand, held it like a mother holds a daughter, like family holds family, like humans hold humans when words are not enough. "War. Bad," Mrs. Anderson said. Her English was simple, but her meaning was infinite. Boys die. Mothers cry. German mother, American mother. All same, all same. 3 syllables that demolished 6 years of propaganda. German mothers and American mothers crying the same tears. German brothers and American brothers dying the same deaths. The enemy's grief identical to her own grief. The enemy's love identical to her own love. They were not monsters. They were not subhuman. They were not the corrupted weaklings Nazi ideology promised. They were just people. People who loved their children. People who feared loss. People who wanted the war to end so their sons could come home. Margaret broke completely. She cried in a way she had not cried since childhood. Deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere beneath thought. Mrs. Anderson held her through all of it. 2 women from enemy nations, both missing sons and brothers, both casualties of a war. They never started holding each other in the dirt while the summer sun burned overhead. When the tears finally stopped, something new existed where Margaret's certainty used to be. She looked at Mrs. Anderson and saw her own mother. She looked at the photograph of James and saw Heinz. She looked at the farm and saw what Germany could have been if different choices had been made. She looked at herself and saw not a prisoner or a traitor, but simply a human being who had been lied to her entire adult life. The propaganda was false. All of it. The Americans were not monsters. Democracy was not weakness. Freedom was not chaos. The Reich had built its empire on lies, and those lies had murdered millions, destroyed nations, turned Margaret's homeland into rubble. She had believed. She had believed. And the belief had been poison. That night, Margaret wrote in her diary by candlelight. Her hand shook so badly, the words were barely legible. They defeated us with kindness. Not bombs, not bullets. Kindness. They showed us what we could have been. They proved everything we believed was wrong. How do I go home and tell my parents that our leaders lied, that we destroyed ourselves for nothing, that the enemy was better than us all along? The transformation was not instant. Beliefs built over years do not vanish in one afternoon. But the foundation had cracked beyond repair. Every day afterward, Margaret saw more clearly. Every conversation confirmed what Mrs. Anderson's hand holding hers had proven. The American system worked. Not perfectly, not without flaws, but it worked in ways Germany's system never had. Farmers could criticize their government, women could vote, newspapers printed different opinions, citizens questioned authority without fear. The nation fought a war across 2 oceans while its cities remained untouched and its people remained fed. This was not weakness. This was strength so profound Germany had never recognized it. August brought news that changed everything. A bomb unlike any weapon in history fell on Hiroshima. Then Nagasaki. Japan surrendered days later. The European War had ended in May. Now the Pacific War was over too. The killing finally stopped. Margaret should have felt joy. Instead, she felt terror. The war ending meant repatriation, going home, facing her family, explaining why she looked healthy while they starved, describing the kindness of enemies while her neighbors had suffered cruelty from their own government. How could she go back? Hannah voiced what all 3 women feared. They will hate us. We have been fed by the enemy while they ate grass. We have been warm while they froze. We are traitors without ever choosing to be. Elizabeth shook her head. We are survivors. That is all. We did not ask to be captured. We did not ask for kindness. We simply lived when we could have died. There is no treason in that. But Margaret knew the truth was more complicated. She had not merely survived. She had been changed. The Margaret who climbed into that truck in March was dead. The Margaret who existed now believed different things, saw the world differently, could never again accept what she had once accepted. She was returning to Germany as a different person, and Germany would not understand. Mrs. Anderson helped her prepare, gave her clothes, gave her food for the journey, gave her the address of the farm, and made her promise to write. The goodbye was long and painful. 2 women who had become family despite everything that should have made them enemies. You tell them, Mrs. Anderson said. Tell them what you saw. Americans, not monsters. Maybe helps, maybe not, but you tell them. Margaret promised. The journey home took weeks. Trucks and trains and ships and processing centers. Red Cross workers checking names against endless lists. Slowly, painfully, the prisoners were sorted and sent toward whatever remained of Germany. Margaret traveled with Hannah and Elizabeth as long as possible. They had become sisters in captivity. The separation, when their paths finally diverged, felt like losing limbs. Tearful goodbyes, addresses exchanged, promises to write that both knew might never be kept. When Margaret finally reached Munich, the shock nearly killed her. She had seen photographs. She had heard descriptions. Nothing prepared her for reality. Mountains of rubble where neighborhoods used to stand. Survivors living in cellars and makeshift shelters. Children with faces too old for their bodies. Elderly people who looked like ghosts. The smell of smoke and decay still hanging in the air months after the bombing stopped. This was what Germany's lies had purchased. This was the cost of believing. She found her parents in the basement of what had been their apartment building. The building itself was gone, just rubble and twisted metal. But the basement remained shared now by 6 families with nothing left. Her mother did not recognize her at first. Margaret was too healthy, too well-dressed, too alive. When recognition came, her mother collapsed in her arms, sobbing a name she had probably never expected to hear again. But Margaret saw her father's face, saw the questions forming, saw the calculation happening behind his hollow eyes. His daughter had been captured by the enemy and returned looking better than when she left. While he had starved and suffered and lost everything, his daughter had been fed and sheltered and kept safe by the people who destroyed his nation. The interrogation would come. The explanations would be demanded. The impossible task of describing kindness to people who had only known cruelty. Margaret had survived the war. She had survived captivity. She had survived transformation. Now came the hardest battle of all, surviving the homecoming. And in the ruins of Munich, surrounded by people who had lost everything Margaret Hoffman had, to find a way to tell the truth about the enemy, without becoming the enemy herself. What happened when she finally spoke? How did her family react? And what did Margaret's story mean for the future of Germany? In Part 1, Margaret Hoffman climbed into a truck expecting execution and found a farm instead. In Part 2, a photograph and 4 simple words shattered everything she believed about the enemy. Mrs. Anderson held her hand and said what 6 years of propaganda had denied. German mothers and American mothers are the same. War is the enemy, not the people on the other side. Margaret was transformed, but transformation means nothing if you cannot survive it. Now she stood in the ruins of Munich, facing parents who had starved while she grew healthy, neighbors who had suffered while she was sheltered, a nation that had lost everything while she gained something she never expected. The truth. And the truth was about to become the most dangerous weapon she had ever carried. Here is a statistic that explains what happened next. By September 1945, over 300,000 German prisoners had been repatriated from American camps. 300,000 men and women carrying the same impossible burden as Margaret. They had seen the enemy up close. They had experienced kindness where propaganda promised cruelty. They had eaten full meals while their families starved. And now they were home surrounded by people who would never understand. The psychological warfare had worked perfectly, but nobody had planned for what came next. Margaret's father asked the question on the 3rd day. They sat in the basement that had become home. 6 families sharing one space. A single candle for light. Watery soup that Margaret could barely force herself to eat. Her mother had not stopped touching her since she arrived, as if afraid she might vanish again. But her father watched, calculated. His eyes moved across her healthy body, her clean clothes, the way she flinched at food that would have seemed luxurious a year ago. How did you survive so well? The question was quiet, dangerous, loaded with accusation. Margaret had prepared for this moment during the entire journey home. She had rehearsed answers, practiced lies, built walls to protect herself from exactly this question. But looking at her father's hollow face, at the bones showing through her mother's skin, at the basement full of people who had lost everything while she lost nothing, the lies would not come. They fed us, she said. The Americans. They fed us well. Silence. The kind of silence that falls before explosions. Fed you well. Her father's voice cracked. We ate rats. We ate wallpaper paste. Your mother collapsed twice from hunger. And you were fed well. Margaret's mother squeezed her hand. Tried to intervene. But her father was not finished. While German cities burned. While your brother died in Russia. While we watched children starve in the streets. The Americans fed you. Yes. The word hung in the air like poison gas. Why? Her father demanded. Why would they feed the enemy? Margaret could have lied, could have claimed she did not know, could have pretended confusion or gratitude without explanation. That would have been safer. That would have protected her. Instead, she told the truth. Because they are not monsters. Because their system works. Because everything we were told about them was a lie. Her father stood up so fast, the candle nearly went out. His face twisted with rage and something worse. Betrayal. You defend them. After what they did to Germany. After the bombs and the destruction and the death, you defend them. They did not start this war. We did. The slap came so fast, Margaret did not see it. One moment she was speaking. The next, she was on the ground. her face burning, her father standing over her with a hand still raised. Her mother screamed. Neighbors grabbed her father's arms. Chaos erupted in the tiny basement. Children crying, adults shouting, accusations flying. Traitor! The word came from someone in the crowd. Traitor. American whore. Collaborator. Margaret lay on the cold floor, tasting blood, understanding finally what her transformation would cost. The truth was suicide, but she could not take it back. The following weeks were the hardest of Margaret's life. Harder than captivity. Harder than the fear of death. Because now she faced something worse than physical danger. She faced isolation from everyone she loved. Her father refused to speak to her, left the basement whenever she entered. Her mother tried to mediate, but the damage was too deep. The neighborhood whispered. People she had known her entire life looked at her with disgust. The girl who defended Americans. The prisoner who came back fat while everyone else starved. The accusations cut deeper because they contained truth. She had been fed while they starved. She had gained weight while children died. She had experienced kindness while her nation suffered cruelty. The unfairness was real. The resentment was justified. But Margaret could not unsee what she had seen, could not unfeel Mrs. Anderson's hand holding hers, could not unlearn the truth about democracy and freedom and human dignity that the farm had taught her. She was trapped between two worlds, the Germany that existed in ruins around her and the America that existed in her memory. Neither would accept her fully. Both demanded she choose. Some nights she considered simply agreeing, nodding along when people cursed Americans, pretending she had suffered in captivity, becoming the victim everyone wanted her to be. It would have been so much easier. But then she would remember Mr. Anderson teaching her English words, Mrs. Anderson crying about James, the photograph of her brother that connected enemy to enemy through shared grief, the moment when propaganda died and truth was born. She could not betray that, even if honesty destroyed her. The turning point came on an October evening, cold rain falling, the basement leaking in 3 places. Margaret sat alone while her parents attended some neighborhood gathering she had not been invited to. A knock on the basement door. Soft, tentative. Margaret opened it to find a face she barely recognized, emaciated, hollow-eyed, but familiar somehow. Margaret. The voice triggered memory. Anna Weiss. They had been friends before the war, had lost contact when Anna's family moved east. Margaret had assumed she was dead like so many others. Anna collapsed into her arms, sobbing, shaking, barely able to stand. Over the next hour, between tears and whispered words, Anna told her story. She had been in one of the camps. Not a prisoner camp, a camp. The kind nobody talked about yet. The kind where cattle cars arrived full and left empty. She had survived because she was useful, because she worked, because luck favored her when it abandoned millions of others. I saw things, Anna whispered, things I cannot speak about, things that make me understand why we lost, why we deserved to lose. Margaret held her friend and understood finally that she was not alone. That transformation had happened to others too. That truth had broken through walls all across Germany in different ways. I was in America, Margaret said. I worked on a farm. They treated me like a human being. Anna looked up. Her eyes held something Margaret had not expected. Hope. Tell me everything. So Margaret did. She described the farm, the food, the Andersons, the photograph moment, the hand holding hers, the words that shattered belief, all of it. Every detail she had been afraid to speak. Anna listened without interrupting. When Margaret finished, Anna said something that changed the trajectory of everything. You have to tell others. Tell. Not the ones who will not hear, but the ones who are ready. The ones who have seen enough to know the lies were lies. They need to hear what you experienced. They need to know another way exists. Who would listen? Everyone who matters. Anna's voice grew stronger. The young ones, the ones who will rebuild, the ones who have no investment in defending what destroyed us. Tell them. It was dangerous advice. Speaking positively about Americans in 1945, Germany could bring violence, social death at minimum, physical harm at worst. The country was broken, but pride remained. Wounded pride is the most dangerous kind. But Anna was right. Some people were ready to hear. Some minds were already cracked and waiting for the truth to break through. Margaret started small. Conversations with young people in breadlines. Whispered stories during the long nights of winter. Always careful. Always watching for the faces that closed with anger and the faces that opened with curiosity. She found others like herself. Returned prisoners who had experienced American kindness and could not reconcile it with propaganda. They formed an invisible network, sharing stories, confirming each other's experiences, building a counter-narrative one conversation at a time. The stories spread. Slowly at first, then faster. I heard the Americans fed their prisoners real food. I heard they let German women vote in camp elections. I heard a farmer in Illinois treated German workers like family. I heard. Truth traveled through rubble like water through cracks. It could not be stopped. It could not be contained. It reached the young people who would rebuild Germany and planted seeds that would grow for decades. By spring 1946, something had shifted. The initial rage at defeat had cooled. The reality of occupation set in. American soldiers were everywhere, and they were not behaving like monsters. They handed out chocolate to children. They enforced rules, but did not massacre. They rebuilt infrastructure instead of destroying it further. The propaganda could not survive contact with reality. Just as it had failed for Margaret on the Anderson farm, it failed for Germany on a national scale. Her father finally spoke to her again in April 1946. He found her alone in the basement, writing a letter to Mrs. Anderson. His face had changed. Something broken there. Something rebuilt differently. "I met an American soldier today," he said quietly. "In the street. I expected him to spit on me or beat me or worse. He asked if I needed food. Margaret said nothing. Waited. He gave me chocolate." Her father's voice cracked. "Real chocolate. For no reason. Just because I looked hungry." The silence stretched. Her father sat down across from her. Old, tired, defeated in ways that went beyond losing a war. "You tried to tell me," he said. "I did not want to hear." Margaret reached across and took his hand. The same gesture Mrs. Anderson had used. Human connection across impossible divides. They held hands in the darkness of a ruined basement, while somewhere above them, a new Germany struggled to be born. Margaret eventually made contact with the Andersons again. Letters crossing the ocean. Photographs exchanged. James had survived the war, come home, married, had children. Mrs. Anderson wrote about grandchildren and harvests and the chickens Margaret had learned to tend. In 1958, Margaret returned to Illinois. She stood in the kitchen where her transformation began and wept in the arms of an old woman who had shown mercy when hatred would have been easier. The farm looked exactly as she remembered. White house, green shutters, red barn, fields stretching to the horizon. Peace so profound, it hurt. She brought her daughter. Let her see where her mother had been reborn. Let her meet the Americans who proved that enemies were humans and kindness was strength. Mrs. Anderson, old now, and moving slowly, took the little girl's hand and said the same words she had said to Margaret 13 years earlier. "Welcome." The cycle continued. Enemies becoming family. Hatred transforming to love. One hand holding another across divides that war had created and peace had healed. Margaret lived long enough to see Germany reunited, to see Europe whole and at peace, to see the seeds planted by American mercy grow into forests of democracy and cooperation and shared humanity. But what happened to those seeds? What grew from the strange weapon of kindness that America deployed without fully understanding its power? And what does Margaret's story mean for a world that still struggles to see enemies as human beings? Let me tell you how one truck ride changed history. In Part 1, Margaret Hoffman climbed into a military vehicle expecting death and found a farm instead. In Part 2, A photograph and a mother's grief shattered every lie she had ever believed about the enemy. In Part 3, she returned to a ruined Germany and faced the impossible task of speaking truth to people who only wanted to hate. But what happened to Margaret after the rubble was cleared? What grew from the seeds planted by American kindness in the soil of defeated Germany? And why does this story matter more today than ever before? Here is the twist. Nobody saw coming. The United States did not just win World War II with bombs and bullets. They won with breakfast, with clean beds, with photographs shared between enemies, with the simple radical act of treating prisoners like human beings. And that victory lasted longer than any military conquest in history. Margaret Hoffman lived until 2003, 78 years old, when she finally closed her eyes. She had witnessed the complete arc of the 20th century, the rise of fascism, the destruction of war, the miracle of rebuilding, the reunification of Germany, the birth of the European Union. Peace where there had only been blood. She never became famous. No statues were built. No history books mentioned her name. She was one of hundreds of thousands of German prisoners who passed through American farms and camps, each carrying the same impossible burden of transformation. But Margaret did something most of them did not. She kept writing. The diary she started on the Anderson farm grew into dozens of notebooks over the decades. She recorded everything: the meals she ate, the conversations she had, the moment Mrs. Anderson took her hand, the slap from her father, the slow reconciliation, the letters crossing the Atlantic, every detail preserved in careful handwriting that generations would eventually read. Her daughter found the diaries after Margaret died, boxes of them stored in an attic, a lifetime of witness testimony from someone who had seen both the worst and best of humanity. The daughter Eva was 62 years old when she opened those boxes. She had heard her mother's stories many times. But reading them in Margaret's own words with the raw emotion still bleeding through decades-old ink broke something open inside her. She began transcribing, then translating, then sharing. Margaret's diaries became part of an oral history project documenting German prisoner experiences in America. Researchers discovered that her story was not unique. It was typical. The overwhelming majority of German POWs reported similar experiences: decent treatment, adequate food, respect for their humanity. Many wrote home during captivity, describing conditions their families could not believe. One letter from a German prisoner in Texas, discovered in family archives, contained a line that encapsulates the entire psychological warfare strategy. "They feed us better than our own army fed us. What kind of enemy does this?" That question echoed through 300,000 minds. What kind of enemy shows mercy? What kind of nation treats prisoners with dignity? What kind of people could have been so demonized by propaganda, yet behave so differently in reality? The answers those prisoners developed became the foundation of post-war Germany. But Margaret's legacy extended beyond diaries. She raised 3 children in the new Germany that emerged from rubble. She taught them what the Anderson farm had taught her: that enemies are human, that kindness defeats hatred, that democracy for all its flaws creates something worth defending. Her children grew up questioning authority instead of blindly obeying it. They learned to see propaganda for what it was. They understood that nations could be wrong, that leaders could lie, that individual conscience mattered more than collective obedience. This was the real victory. Not territory conquered or enemies killed, but minds transformed, values planted, a generation raised to reject everything that had made the war possible. And Margaret was just one prisoner. Multiply her story by 300,000. 300,000 Germans returning home with the same cognitive dissonance, the same shattered beliefs, the same questions about everything they had been taught. 300,000 seeds scattered across a destroyed nation, each one growing into something new. The American policy of treating prisoners humanely was not charity. It was the most sophisticated psychological operation of the entire war. and it worked beyond anyone's imagination. Consider the statistics. Germany had been the most militaristic nation in Europe for generations. Prussian discipline, obedience to authority, glorification of war. These values had survived. World War I survived the Weimar Republic, survived every attempt at reform. Yet within 20 years of World War II ending, Germany had become one of the most pacifist nations on earth. Military spending dropped to historic lows. Conscientious objection became common. The very idea of German aggression became unthinkable. How does a nation transform so completely in a single generation? Part of the answer: walked off American farms carrying stories they could not forget. 300,000 witnesses testifying that the enemy was not what they had been told. 300,000 cracks in the foundation of militarism that eventually brought the whole structure crumbling down. The policy continued after World War II. American treatment of prisoners became doctrine. The lessons learned on Illinois farms were applied in Korea and Vietnam in every conflict that followed. Not always perfectly, not without failures and atrocities that violated the principles, but the framework remained. The Geneva Convention became sacred precisely because America had demonstrated its power. Countries that torture prisoners create enemies who fight to the death. Countries that treat prisoners humanely create former enemies who question whether they should have been enemies at all. This is not weakness. This is strategic genius disguised as morality. Margaret understood this by the end of her life. She wrote in her final diary, completed just months before her death. They did not defeat us with weapons. They defeated us with the truth about themselves. Every meal I ate on that farm was a bullet in the heart of Nazi ideology. Every kind word was a bomb that destroyed lies. They showed us what they were, and we could not unsee it. That is how you truly win a war, not by killing the enemy, by making the enemy realize they were never really enemies at all. The deeper lesson of Margaret's story goes beyond military strategy. It speaks to something fundamental about human nature and the systems we build. Nazi Germany was built on the idea that some people were superior and others were inferior, that enemies deserved no mercy, that strength meant cruelty, that power justified any action. America in 1945 was far from perfect. Racism persisted. Injustice existed. The ideals were not always matched by reality, but the system allowed for something Nazi Germany never could: self-correction, criticism, change. American soldiers could question their officers. Citizens could criticize their government. Newspapers could print opposing views. When mistakes were made, they could be acknowledged and addressed. The system was designed to improve, not to demand blind obedience. This is what Margaret discovered on the Anderson farm. Not that Americans were better people than Germans, but that American institutions created space for humanity to express itself. The Andersons were kind because they lived in a society that allowed and encouraged kindness. They treated enemies with dignity because nothing forced them to do otherwise. In Germany, individual kindness was crushed by institutional cruelty. Good people did terrible things because the system demanded it. Conscience was overruled by obedience. Humanity was sacrificed to ideology. The difference was not in the people. The difference was in what the systems brought out of the people. Margaret spent her final decades thinking about this distinction. She became convinced that the real lesson of World War II was not about Germany versus America or fascism versus democracy. It was about what happens when systems demand obedience versus what happens when systems allow conscience. Every society faces this choice. Every generation must decide whether to build institutions that crush humanity or institutions that nurture it. The answer determines everything that follows. And here is the detail that most histories never mention, the twist that makes Margaret's story even more extraordinary. In 1962, 17 years after the war ended, Margaret received a package from Illinois. Inside was a photograph she had never seen. Mrs. Anderson had taken it during Margaret's time on the farm without her knowledge. It showed Margaret in the vegetable garden laughing at something off camera her face full of joy, despite being a prisoner in an enemy nation. On the back of the photograph in Mrs. Anderson's careful handwriting were words that Margaret could not read without crying for the rest of her life. "This is the Margaret I want to remember. Not the enemy, not the prisoner. Just a young woman who deserved to laugh. May you laugh for all the years the war stole from you." Mrs. Anderson had died 3 months before sending this package. Her son James had found it among her belongings with instructions to mail it to Margaret. A final gift across the ocean. A final act of kindness from beyond the grave. Margaret framed that photograph. Kept it on her bedside table until her own death 41 years later. Every morning, she woke to the image of herself laughing in an enemy's garden. Every night, she fell asleep reminded that mercy was possible, that kindness survived war, that human connection could transcend the worst divisions humanity created. The photograph now sits in a German museum dedicated to reconciliation. Visitors see a young woman laughing amid vegetables, and most do not understand the layers of meaning contained in that simple image. But those who know the story see something else. They see the moment when propaganda died. They see the weapon that won a war without firing a shot. They see the proof that enemies are only enemies until someone chooses to treat them as human beings. From a telephone operator in a defeated army to a witness whose diaries changed how we understand psychological warfare. From a prisoner who expected death to a grandmother who taught her children that kindness defeats hatred. From one truck ride on a March morning to a legacy that shaped the most peaceful period in European history. Margaret Hoffman was nobody special, just a young woman caught in forces beyond her control. And that is precisely the point. The American strategy worked not because it targeted important people, but because it targeted everyone. Every prisoner, every farm, every meal shared between enemies, every small act of dignity that added up to something enormous. The statistics are staggering when you step back far enough to see them. 300,000 German prisoners in America, 90% reporting fair treatment, majority returning home with fundamentally altered views of their former enemy. 1 generation later, Germany transformed from the most dangerous nation in Europe to one of its most peaceful. No weapon in history has achieved such complete victory with so little bloodshed. And it all started with 5 words spoken on a frozen March morning. Get in the truck. Words that Margaret thought meant death, but actually meant rebirth. Words that began a journey from enemy to family, from hatred to understanding, from war to peace. Mrs. Anderson never knew the full impact of her kindness. She simply treated people the way she wanted her own son treated if he were captured. She followed conscience instead of hatred. She chose humanity over ideology. And that choice, multiplied by thousands of similar choices on farms across America, won a war that could not be won with bombs alone. If you know similar stories from World War II, share them in the comments. History is full of moments when ordinary people made extraordinary choices. Moments when kindness changed everything. Moments when enemies became family. This is just one of hundreds of untold stories from the greatest conflict in human history. Subscribe to discover more accounts that deserve to be remembered. And remember what Margaret learned in that Illinois kitchen with eggs warm on her plate and tears streaming down her face. The strongest weapon is not the one that kills your enemy. It is the one that makes your enemy realize you were never really enemies at all.